Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. I'm Chuck Mason, and with me today is my co-host, Janelle Blue. Janelle is president of the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society, who sponsors us. And our guest today is Linda MacLachlan. Linda is a researcher, a trainer, an author, and specializes in colonial Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut research. And prior to her retirement, she was an attorney in the St. Louis area, and she is also a past president of the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society. And today we're going to talk about something that if you were to Google the Great Migration, you would probably come up with a lot of pages of information about African Americans and their movement from the South to the North after the Civil War. But there was an earlier Great Migration in the life of our country, a couple hundred years. This was the Pilgrims and the Puritans coming from England over to New England in the 1600s. So welcome, Linda, and we want to know a little bit about the Great Migration movement. What kind of people came to the area? What area did they come to, and what states did it eventually become?
Well, there were 5 different charters that were granted by England for people to settle in the New England area. The first one is the one that everybody knows about in Plymouth, where the Pilgrims came in 1620, and they were the first. Then there was the Massachusetts Bay settlers. They came to the area around Boston and Salem and spread out from there, which was a very large group. Then people broke out of that group and moved to the Connecticut River Valley, which was very fertile country, and they formed river towns along the Connecticut River in what's now Connecticut, or most of them are in what's now Connecticut. One ended up still in Massachusetts. Finally, well, there are 2 more. The New Haven colonists were separate. They settled, they thought that they could create a great port on Long Island Sound, and they settled in 1636 in the city of New Haven. Finally, the towns of Rhode Island were formed, and that's a very interesting story because each Rhode Island town was formed by a group that dissented strongly from Massachusetts Bay, that Massachusetts Bay really wanted to get rid of. And so they went to Rhode Island and formed a town in Rhode Island. What this meant was that the different towns in Rhode Island were each settled by a different dissenting group, and they didn't get along with each other either.
What were they dissenting about from Massachusetts?
Religious matters.
Okay.
The main matter, of course, Roger Williams is the one who comes to mind. He was the founder of Rhode Island, and he believed very strongly in freedom of religion, and that the state ought not to have anything to do with religion. And of course, in Plymouth and in Massachusetts Bay and in the Connecticut colonies, the church and the governing bodies were all one group. And as a matter of fact, in New Haven, they were actually a theocracy. And he very much opposed this. But each group that came to New England opposed, on religious grounds, something in Massachusetts, but not all the same thing. As a result of that, Massachusetts Bay finally decided that they were going to take over these fractious people who were misbehaving even in Rhode Island. And Rhode Island, to defend itself, went to New England finally and got a charter. They had not gotten a charter originally. What they had done, as opposed to the rest of the colonies, is they had bought their land directly from the Indians.
Oh.
Roger Williams very strongly believed that the king had no right to sell Indian land out from under the Indians. And so he and the other people in Rhode Island bought their land straight from the Indians, so they didn't have a charter at the beginning. But he went back and got one so that Massachusetts couldn't take them back over again.
Why did England promote this? Why did people come? I mean, what was in it for England to let the people come?
Well, the Pilgrims were, of course, separate from England already then. If you remember, if you recall your history, the Pilgrims left England and went to Holland and spent a generation living in Holland and discovered that didn't really work out so well, and so they went to the New World. And that had very little to do with England. They were already essentially divorced from the English church. The rest of the Puritans were not divorced from the English church. What they wanted to do was convert the English church to their ways. They thought that the English church, unlike the Protestant churches in Germany and across the continent, the English church was too much like the Catholic church. It still had all the murals on the walls and all the saints as statues, and they wanted the religion to be pure. They were essentially Calvinists.
Okay.
And so they very much disagreed with the way religion was performed in England. Some more than others, but all of them were, that's what a Puritan meant. It was somebody who wanted to purify the religion, but not just for themselves. They wanted to do it for all of England. So they weren't prepared to divorce themselves from the Church of England the way the Pilgrims were.
I see.
And of course, that's how the Great Migration finally ended, was they won in England. Oliver Cromwell took over England in 1640 in the Glorious Revolution. Some of them actually went back at that point. But the church became a Puritan church at that point until Charles II finally restored the kingdom. There's a map that we have here that shows all of the Connecticut towns that were established in these 5 colonies. And they expanded very, very rapidly. There were 5 to begin with, but by 1640 there were 60 towns in this area.
So was it like word of mouth got back and then other people came, or did they just spread out? Because why were these different colonies formed? Was it new groups, or was it just expanding?
Well, the Connecticut River Valley was an expansion to new fertile land. The Connecticut River, if you can see it from the map, it's a very important river. It goes from Long Island Sound all the way up to Vermont. It's navigable the whole way up to Vermont. So it's a very important transport route. And so that's why they wanted to settle the Connecticut River Valley. New Haven, as I say, was a theocracy. They were even stricter than Massachusetts Bay or the Pilgrims about their religion. They were completely, you had to be a loyal member of the church in order to have anything to say in the colony at all. You could not become a free man in the colony without being a church member. The same thing was true in Massachusetts Bay. That was not true in Rhode Island.
And what is a free man?
A free man is essentially a voter. Gives you the right to vote. This has to do with, do you want to get into the way that the colonies were governed at this point? Each colony was governed by what was called the General Court. The General Court was a body that comprised both the legislative and the executive and the judicial functions all in one body that met once a year. And it had a representative elected from every town within that colony. The rest of the government, other than that general court, was in the town. Each town governed itself. And each church governed itself. That's why they're called congregational churches. They were governed by the congregation. No bishops over here. The New Englanders that had their fill of bishops in England, and they didn't want anything more to do with bishops. So the towns ruled everything. And the important thing about New England research that New England makes it different from the rest of America is the meaning of the word town. Town does not mean what it means nowadays. It's essentially what we now call a township. Every inch of land was in a town, a township. And so everybody belonged to a town, even if they were out on a farm.
Okay.
So the town included everybody, and the towns had truly democratic governments. The town was run by a town meeting where everybody all the freemen would show up and they would vote on everything directly. They didn't have representatives representing them. They were there themselves.
So the freemen were voters. How did
Yes.
how did they become designated as freemen or voters?
Well, you had to be 21 years old.
Okay.
That was true in all the colonies. And in Massachusetts and in New Haven, you had to be a member in good standing of the church.
Aha.
And the church had to approve of you first before you could become a member. As I say, the other colonies were a bit more liberal on that, and Rhode Island was completely liberal on that. You couldn't have anything to do with, the state couldn't have anything to do with religion at all.
And did you have to be a landowner also, or?
You didn't have to be yeah, I think, that's hard to say. Certainly it was associated, they were the freemen were landowners, and you really had to be a landowner in order to, no, you didn't have to be a landowner to marry, but yes, you did have to own some land.
To vote.
They would give you, it was this group, this cabal, maybe I shouldn't, that's a negative word, I really shouldn't use that word, but the group of people who ran the church and ran the town would decide how to give out land. And so they would give it out to people that they approved of, who were obviously members of the church.
Okay. And I assume these were all men.
Yes, definitely.
Interesting question. What happens when the husband dies?
Oh,
Widows did have rights. Now, it frequently happened, especially with innkeepers. If an innkeeper died, his wife was allowed to continue to run the establishment and have the same voting rights that a man would have.
She was probably doing all the work anyway.
Yes, right.
Before he died.
That's true.
Well, and she, of course, had to have a way, if she had children, to support herself and the children.
Right.
So otherwise, she's going to be holding her hand out to the government.
Yeah. Or the church. Yeah.
Yeah, the government obviously wanted the enterprise to continue.
Linda, what's the difference between a pilgrim and a Puritan? It seems that, we sort of use those words interchangeably, but I think there was a difference.
Yeah, I think I've already described it. That they were all Puritans of different levels of strictness.
Okay.
The Pilgrims were called Pilgrims because they had traveled to Holland and divorced themselves entirely from England.
Okay.
That was why they were called Pilgrims, but in fact, they were Puritans too.
Ah, okay.
That make sense?
It helps, yeah.
Okay.
And of course, New England, we all hope that if we have ancestors here for several hundred years, we have New England ancestors because they have such good records.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there was a real spike in migration too, wasn't there?
Yes. We have a chart here that really shows that. It shows that the Pilgrims, when they came, were really an infinitesimal number of people compared with the Massachusetts Bay people who came slightly later. You can see there's not much of an increase in the chart until Governor Winthrop started bringing his people over to Massachusetts Bay starting in 1628. And the peak was 1630. And then they sent back, after they'd settled, they sent back for more. And what happened when you see that spike going all the way up in 1636, Bishop Laud took over in England, L-A-U-D, not L-A-U-D.
Loud.
And he banned the Puritan churches in England. He took their buildings away from them.
Ooh.
And if they continued to meet in private on their own, he would arrest them.
Ah, my goodness.
So they suddenly had a great incentive to leave.
Yeah.
And they left in mass
And
at that point.
Did they leave in the dark of night, or were they allowed to leave? Did they apply to leave? Or
They all had to get permission to leave, yes.
Okay.
Yes. And the king was willing, by and large. He made them sign a loyalty pledge before they left.
Okay.
But other than that, There wasn't that much control, and there wasn't that much control of New England after they arrived. England was having its own problems with the Glorious Revolution and everything else that happened at that point, and for another 100 years, actually. And England did not pay that much attention to governing their colonies, and the colonies really had free rein to do what they wanted to do. And Massachusetts Bay was very careful not to put too much in writing about what they were doing, so that the people in England would figure out before they had everything all squared away and they were settled and ready to govern themselves.
So if you wanted to do research today, I know a lot of our viewers have ancestors that probably came during this period. What kind of records survive today, and where would you go to find those?
Oh, the amount of records is huge. The New Englanders were notorious record keepers. They kept records about everything. And you're right about the people having the number of descendants of these early New Englanders. All the New Englanders had very large families. And so you find that there are a huge number of early New England immigrants who have tens of thousands of descendants in America.
Gosh.
There's just lots of them that have tens of thousands of descendants. And the records are all there to prove it.
My goodness. So what would you advise in terms of researching? Where would you start with those, and what would be some of the best things to start with if you thought that your ancestor was one of the ones in the Great Migration? Where would you begin?
Well, there is the New England Historical and Genealogical Society and its journal, the New England Historic Genealogical Register, the oldest continuously published historical publication in the world. Genealogy began in New England.
Wow.
They began collecting it and transcribing it very early on. The society was established in 1836. And of course, all of the towns kept records from the very beginning. The colony required every town to keep vital records. The first vital records statutes are back in the 1640s.
Lucky for us.
Yes, very definitely.
So New England Historical Society was the first one, and then...
Yes, they have a library in Boston, and they have a website online called AmericanAncestors.org.
Oh, yes. That's very good.
And it's a subscription website, but if you go to any family history center in the United States, you can access the website for free.
So that's really good. And then what about in the states, like Connecticut State Library and those?
The Connecticut State Library is the most important place to go for Connecticut records. They have collected huge amounts of records, not only public records, but private records there. For instance, at one point they asked all the churches if the churches of Connecticut would like to donate their old records to the state library in exchange for a microfilm copy that they would have themselves. Wow. And they all did. They donated. It's easier to have somebody else take care of old records. And so they got this massive collection of all of the church records of Connecticut that they maintain. So it's not just public records, it's private records too that they have enormous collections of there.
And are those like on Ancestry nowadays, or do you know?
Some of them are on Ancestry, some of them are on Family Search, of course, went around the whole country microfilming everything.
Yeah.
They went to every single early New England town and copied the records there.
Wow.
They were not complete in what they did. They didn't realize that, unfortunately, that the New Englanders started keeping records before they were really organized about doing it. And so the early vital records of most towns are simply scattered notations in deed books or town minutes books. And the Utah did not systematically microfilm all books. They microfilmed the ones that they thought had genealogy in them. And so they left out the town meeting minutes. And so some records were missed that way.
Have they been microfilmed by any other group and available, or?
There are still records in virtually every New England town that have not been microfilmed by anybody. People are still discovering. I've discovered some myself. It's a real adventure.
Well, and one of the things I know, they weren't always allowed to copy the records. For example, when they went to the New Jersey State Archives and wanted to do the vital records, they only allowed them to do the records up to 1878. Then everything else was commercially done, and I assume paid for by the state. So nothing is in Salt Lake past 1878 as far as vital records. You have to go to the state archives in Trenton. So
In most New England states, it goes. They microfilmed into the early 1900s.
Yeah. Well, in the county records, they allowed them access to them to basically 1900, but the vital records was one group that they restricted, and I don't know why.
Yeah, county records were not that important. As a matter of fact, there weren't counties originally in New England. The first ones were established in 1643 around Boston. Before that, there were none at all. The town really took care of everything, and when a function became too large or too frequent to really handle with a quarterly meeting, then it would be farmed out, and that's when counties started being formed. They were first formed for criminal cases and for probate cases. Although in Connecticut, the probate cases never went to the county. They set up separate probate districts. That's another difference.
I haven't done as much research in these states, but in New Hampshire, I found that the little towns often had historical societies.
Yes.
And that they wrote as much history as they could, that would go back as far as it could. And then some of those are actually online.
Yes, some of those are online.
And those have, names. I mean, you can't search it, but by surname, but you can just read it. And I found the person I was looking for, that it was in there. It was mentioned that, because they talk about everything that people do. There's, everything was important in those days, and so.
And for towns that are too small to have a historical society, the public library frequently had that function. And you go to the main public library in these little towns, and it's amazing. They'll have collections of obituaries and all sorts of stuff.
So I see you brought a book along that, is that like the go-to book for the Great Migration?
It is. When you're talking about the people who came in the Great Migration between 1620 and 1640, this is the authoritative source on this book. This is one of more than a dozen books written by Robert Charles Anderson, but this is the most important one. This one was done in 2015. And what Robert Charles Anderson has done in this book is he has listed every single New England immigrant.
Oh my gosh.
Every either an individual came by himself or a family who came in. If a family came in a group, he considers them a group. But he mentions their name, where they came from, when they came, where they settled, and what the best sources are to look at for each person. And if your Great Migration immigrant is mentioned in this list, then you know it has been proven by Robert Charles Anderson that this person was in America by 1640. There are a lot of people who genealogists think were in America by 1640 who are not in this book. But Robert Charles Anderson very carefully used current genealogical proof standards to prove whether there really was proof somebody was in New England by 1640 or not. And if they weren't, if there is no such proof for that person, they're not on this list, which is also important. It's important not only that people are on this list, but the people are off this list. Because in doing his research, Robert Charles Anderson looked at all of the records in all of all the vital records, all of the family history books.
Wow.
He looked at everything that was available to make his judgment about whether there was proof that this person was in New England by 1640. And so if your person is not on this list, there's no point in going to any of these hundreds of books that he has listed here to look for it, because he's already looked and hasn't found them there.
Wow, that is so helpful.
Yes, he is the greatest living New England genealogist. He's a fellow of the Society of American Genealogists.
And is he still doing research, or
Yes.
he is still?
Oh yeah.
Still continuing.
Well, you've written a book of your own over here, I think.
Yes. Yeah, my husband's ancestors settled in Hebron, Connecticut, and I found all these records in Hebron that other people had not found before by going to the town hall and by going to the Connecticut State Library, both. I gathered together all of the records that nobody else had found on Hebron, and it made a very thick book.
So it just goes to prove that there's a whole lot of those kinds of things yet out there for people to do. If you've got the time and the inclination, there's still plenty to do in those.
Oh yes, oh yes.
Linda, we're just about out of time. Is there anything really important that you feel we need to stick in before we go?
If we could go back to that list of sources, I could mention a couple of the other sources that are on that list. There was a marvelous compilation of research that was done way back in 1860 about all of the immigrants who came to New England, and basically joins together the first 3 generations in New England. And it's amazing how James Savage, the author of this book, put it together without help of a computer. I don't know how he did it, but it has stood the test of time. It's amazingly accurate. And another source that's on that list is a manuscript, a 12-volume manuscript that was written by Clarence Torrey, who was a librarian at the New England Historical and Genealogical Society, where he lists every single book that was written or article that mentions every single couple that was married in New England by 1700.
Well, thank you for being with us. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. We'll have to invite you back again for a part 2.
And please visit the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society if you get a chance. We're at 1500 Shenandoah Road in Alexandria, and we meet every 3rd Tuesday of the month.